Lenin walks around the world. Frontiers cannot bar him. Neither barracks nor barricades impede, nor does barbed wire scar him. Lenin walks around the world. Black, brown, and white receive him. Language is no barrier. The strangest tongues believe him. Lenin walks around the world. The sun sets like a scar. Between the darkness and the dawn, there rises a red star.
Yellow fellows, today we are going to be talking about the man, the myth, the legend, the titan among humanity, the founder of one of the greatest strains of Marxism, the most successful strains of Marxism, the man whose ideas and analysis and syntheses lifted millions of people out of poverty and opened up the Pandora's box that a new world was possible outside of our capitalist hellhole. Lenin. Of course, Lenin was a human being who was limited. He was not a god. But his analysis, his scientific contributions to scientific socialism stand as one of the greatest contributions to Marxism and the science of Marxism since the birth of Marx. And Lenin perfectly, beautifully expanded Marxism both to the imperialist stage of capitalism and expanded on Marx's analysis on how to get a communist revolution done and how to do it successfully. And in that, Lenin's contributions to the science of Marxism are immortal. If there lies a future in humanity, beyond this ethno-fascist eco-collapse that neoliberal capitalism seems to be driving us headfirst into, it lies in men like Lenin and Lenin's ideas. So without further ado, let's study Lenin's life. So Lenin was born on April 22nd in 1870 to a lower middle-class family of six. Now, Lenin has been described as both coming from noble family and a peasant family by several biographers. It's sort of both. He was from a peasant family that managed to rise within high positions in the Tsarist system. For example, Lenin's great-grandfather even became somewhat close with the Tsar, having risen to the position of a successful-ish doctor. So Lenin's family, ultimately you could say they were peasants that managed to find a successful niche under the Tsar system. And this class of peasants that managed to do that, this upcoming group of intellectuals under Tsarism were deeply distrusted by the Tsarist autocracy because dialectically, contradictorily, as much as the Tsarist autocracy needed these smart intellectuals from the peasant classes in order to transition to capitalism, in order to build up industry, in order to create a successful Russia, they also brought with them dangerous ideas, right? The ideas of liberalism, ideas of democracy, ideas of socialism, ideas that a world beyond the Tsarist peasant autocracy was possible. Because Russia was the least developed country in all of Europe. It was the most behind socioeconomically. Economically, it was still a feudal society. It had some implementations of capitalism, as Lenin would later analyze. Capitalism had penetrated into the peasant areas, and it slowly was becoming capitalist, but it was still largely retained its peasant feudal economy. And socially, it was a Tsarist autocracy ruled by noblemen. So Vladimir Lenin is born on April 22nd of 1870. April 10th, if you're going by the Tsarist calendar. The Tsarist calendar, remember, was different from our calendars, which is why even though the October Revolution happened in November, it's called the October Revolution. Not the November Revolution, even though it should be, going by our calendars. In 1870, in the village of Samira. And Lenin was, a gifted child, as expected. He graduated high school, being gifted in several languages, Greek, Latin, And the thing is, though, by the time he exited high school, Russia changed, right? Lenin was born in a period under Tsar Alexander in which there was a little bit of freedom. Tsar Alexander was the liberal reformer czar. He implemented in some liberal freedoms, some investment in peasant schools, peasant village schools, which is the schools that Lenin went to. But of course, Tsarist autocracy is Tsarist autocracy, even if it is a liberal half measure, even if it is a dog bone. One of my Russian history professors, he said, how on earth could the people of Russia assassinate Tsar Alexander II? He gave them so much. And to that, I sort of just in my head, I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? He's a czar. All he gave them was dog bones. He still retained his nobleman power. It's such a liberal, stupid way of thinking. But anyways, with the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, Russia's empire would be handed off to Tsar Alexander III. And Tsar Alexander III, his child, Tsar Alexander II, would immediately begin cracking down on the liberal freedoms of his father, bringing back the Tsarist autocracy, cracking down on whatever freedoms have been allowed, because the Tsarist system became paranoid about this rising intellectual class that was threatening it. And so peasants who had previously been free under Tsar Alexander II would be put back into servitude under the nobility. Liberal press would be crushed under Tsar Alexander III, and any potential liberal revolutionary challenge to the Tsar state would be cracked down upon immediately. With Tsar Alexander III believing that the burgeoning liberal intelligentsia of Russia represented a dangerous class, one of his statesmen would even say, the children of coachmen, servants, cooks, washerwomen, small shopkeepers, and people of similar type should not be given education because they were a dangerous class, right? So during Lenin's childhood, Russia drew back from whatever liberal freedoms had been given by Alexander II, and it's such a contradiction. Right, Russia at this time was such a contradiction. It was a system with the Tsarist autocracy that was trying to keep a stranglehold on its power while trying to also implement in capitalism and forms of liberalism here or there. It was a contradiction that had to rupture eventually. You cannot keep that contradiction together. Lenin's father was named Ilya Ulyanov. And that was Lenin's birth name, Ulyanov. That was his last name, Ulyanov, Vladimir Ulyanov. He was born to the Ulyanov family. Lenin is a revolutionary name that he took on, right? That wasn't his birth name. It was a cover name that he took on. And Lenin had several names. He went by several names because he was always in and out of jails. His father had been a big devoter to the liberal reforms of Alexander II, including the implementation of the village schools that Lenin had gone to. And he had been a big pusher of, investing in these and pushing Russia towards a liberal path. And when Tsar Alexander III took power and he destroyed all of Ilya Ulyanov, Lenin's father's work, his lifelong work, he would die of a broken heart, basically, at the age of 53, about. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact age, but it was around his 50s, leaving young Lenin and his family behind in the year of 1886. Lenin had a couple siblings. He was born to a family of 3 girls, 3 boys, 6 siblings in total. And his brother Alexander would be the most interesting of all Lenin's brothers, because Alexander Ulyanov would be a revolutionary-minded brother. He would even introduce Lenin to Das Kapital while Alexander was devouring political theory, and he would help Lenin devour political theory. And Alexander would also share in Lenin's political fire. However, Alexander Ulanov's political fire would ultimately cost him his life because he would get arrested for attempting to execute Tsar Alexander III in a revolutionary group called the Narodniks, or People's Will. And with the news of his brother getting arrested and eventually executed, the liberals in the town of Samira, Lenin's hometown, would shun his family, giving Lenin a very early lesson in life to never trust the liberals, because they could not accept that his brother had been part of a revolutionary group to assassinate the Tsar. Alexander Ulanov, that is. About Alexander Ulanov's tactics and the Narodniks and People's Will's tactics, his brother's execution would serve as a great lesson, actually, for Lenin on how to do revolution scientifically. Because Lenin later on would recognize, reflecting on, he never really mentioned his brother by name later on in life, but he did mention the tactics of his brother. So we can sort of discern that this was Lenin reflecting on his brother, though he really didn't mention him much later in life, that much, Alexander Ulanov. But he would recognize that the People's Will, the Narodniks, their actions were individualistic, terroristic actions, and that these lone groups that often assassinated people in the hopes that it would spur the proletariat into revolution magically, right? Like if I go out and shoot an important political figure, suddenly it will magically create revolution. This was an inferior method of implementing in revolution to mass organizing through a vanguard disciplined party. Even during his brother's funeral, Lenin would allegedly say, "No, we won't go that way. That's not the way we must go." And even though this quote has been called into question, it's sort of, even though like this quote, we don't know if he really said it. His sister said that he said it at the funeral, and historians have questioned whether or not he actually said it in actuality. It sort of highlights Lenin's ultimate philosophy that these revolution happens through a vanguard disciplined party that organizes the masses. It doesn't happen through these individualistic actions. It doesn't happen through one man against the world, right? That's what these terroristic groups also often want to do. I'm one man standing up against the world, and through doing this, I'm going to spur the proletariat into revolution. No. You got to organize the proletariat through a party, through the masses. That's how you do revolution. You don't do it through these sporadic actions. The Narodniks that Alexander Ulanov was part of pushed for socialism, right? So at that time, the general idea was that socialism was not possible in Russia. This was orthodox Marxism, right? Towards the end of his life, Marx did recognize that something special might come out of Russia, right? Marx, started changing his mind about possible revolution in Russia. But towards the beginning of his life and most of Marx's works, and this was the orthodox idea at the time in Europe, everybody saw, including the Narodniks, that socialism was not possible without liberalism, especially the free speech and the ability to organize a proletariat under liberalism. That was a necessary item. That liberal freedom of speech, that liberal organization was a necessary step in order to get socialist revolution. And so People's Will, they basically, their analysis, the Narodniks, was that without the freedom of liberalism, there could be no socialist movement. And in that idea, they just basically said, to hell with it. Let's just start assassinating. Let's just start doing these individualistic actions. And Lenin himself would later on go to fundamentally challenge this assumption that the that socialistic revolution cannot happen in a peasant feudal economy. So for anybody who's confused, I'll go back a little. Under traditional Marxism, there's a general idea about how economies develop. First of all, an economy goes through feudalism. feudalism where land is divided amongst noblemen. Noblemen have tenants or peasants, farm that land, they collect taxes from the peasants, and then, all the power is divided between noblemen and a monarch. From feudalism, the economy transitions to capitalism, in which the peasants are driven off of their lands. They become workers. They become proletarians, right? So a peasant is this farmer, tenant farmer, basically under a nobleman. A worker is a proletarian who works in a new setting, in an urban setting. He sells his labor power to a capitalist, the bourgeois. And the bourgeois buys his labor power. He takes off the surplus value, right, whatever that worker produces in the factory, and gives him back a little bit of what he produces in a day in his wages, right? So that's capitalism. And capitalism, through its amazing ability to industrialize countries super fast, through its ability to create these industrial hubs and these urban hubs, lays down the foundations for socialism. So that's the orthodox Marxist thinking, right? First of all, you have peasants, then you have under a feudal economy, then you have capitalism and proletarians, and these proletarians become class conscious. They realize that they live in a world of haves and have-nots. The bourgeois own the means of production, and they represent a minority, and the proletarians represent the majority, and they overthrow the bourgeois, and they take the means of production into their own hands, and that's when you get socialism and communism eventually. That was the orthodox thinking. So Russia at this time was still under feudalism, as many people saw. And so that socialism was impossible. You had to have that whole step in the middle. And, especially many people believe that without a liberal capitalist society with free speech to organize the working class openly and freely, socialism could not be achieved anywhere in semi-feudal czarist autocracy. In 1887, after Lenin passed his gymnasium class with the high marks and high school in general, he would enter Kazan University, Kazan, where he would immediately become enmeshed within the revolutionary student politics. And very quickly, he would clash with Tsarist authorities and administrators that had been appointed by Tsar Alexander III to spy on the universities, because Tsar Alexander III no longer trusted the universities and students to be by themselves. He saw universities as hubs of political organization against the Tsarist autocracy, and he was right, as Lenin was. And through his organizing in Kazan University, Lenin would get kicked out almost immediately upon arriving. The event that would get him kicked out is one in which him and his fellow students would run around shouting revolutionary slogans and throwing flyers with revolutionary messages on them everywhere, hoping to spur other students into revolution. And so this is Lenin's earliest political organization. This is Lenin's earliest attempts at organizing politically. And you can kind of see a naivete in Lenin that he would slowly let go of and learn the scientific processes of through trial and error on how to successfully do revolution. In that first attempt, Lenin, upon running around with his flyers, shouting revolutionary slogans, hoping that it would spur people into revolution magically with his group, would get immediately caught by the Tsar's police and kicked out of the university and deported to Kokushkino, Kokushkino. And in that town, he would be heavily monitored. But during his banishment, during his deportation in that town, which I'm not going to pronounce again because I'm butchering it, Lenin would deeply, deeply study and read theory. And finally, when he was allowed to return to Kazan in 1888, he would immediately join an underground communist reading group where he would absorb the works of Marx and Engels and the Russian Marxist Plekhanov, especially Plekhanov's criticisms of the Narodniks and the terroristic adventurous measures. So Lenin, despite being banished, was politically as active as ever, and he was educating himself. And in this communist reading group, he would continue to educate himself. Plekhanov had been a very important Russian Marxist. He was the father of Russian Marxism, in fact. He introduced a lot of Marxist ideas to Russia. And Lenin eventually would even get to know him personally, but they would have a huge ideological fallout later on that we'll talk about. While in Kazan, the Marxist reading group would quickly be discovered by Tsarist authorities and get cracked down on again, with most of the members getting arrested. Lenin, however, would manage to barely eke by and not get arrested, and he would move back to his family in Samira. In Samira, Lenin lived a fully convinced Marxist, right? After being in the student movement for so long, after getting his earliest taste of Das Kapital through his brother Alexander Yulanov, and whether or not Alexander Yulanov gave him his first copy of Das Kapital is kind of debated by scholars. I should add that caveat, but anyways. Lenin had finally, after educating himself after getting deported from Kazan University, had finally become a fully convinced Marxist and tuned into the science of Marxism. In Samira, in his hometown, Lenin would quickly take over the local reading groups, converting people from Narodniks and inventurists to Marxists. So he had a real charisma to him. He had a real ideological conviction to him, and he was able to argue with people and show them that their ideas were wrong, that their Narodnik ideas were wrong in Samira, and able to convert them to Marxism. That's just the amazing power of Lenin, inshallah. And he would often laud that Marxism is not a fixed ideology, that he would often complain about how Marxism had sort of become a dead, mechanical ideology, that it wasn't alive. In 1890, Lenin would move to St. Petersburg to finish his law degree, with him completing 4 years of education and passing the law exam in just one. He would squeeze 4 years of education, of studying for his law exam into 1 year because he'd been kicked out and moved around from university so much. And he would manage to get his law degree and everything, which is amazing. While in St. Petersburg, Lenin would enter the heart of Russian politics. The heart of the Russian workers' movement and the proletarian movement was within St. Petersburg, right? Because in Samira and places like that, it was more peasant. It was more peasant-based economies. But St. Petersburg, that was the industrial hub of Russia. And he would enter into Plekhanov's Emancipation of Labor group, which was spreading Marxist propaganda and organizing amongst the working classes. You know, there was just a lot of social democratic organizing going on. And social democrat, I should add, for some caveats, meant communist back then, what we understand as communist back then. And the communists would eventually have to adopt the term communist because so many people who were not communist, who were false communists, who were liberals with bourgeois ideas would adopt the label of social democrat, and it would completely ruin the term. But back then, social democrat still meant communist. And Lenin would immediately, upon arriving into St. Petersburg, enter into another Marxist reading group and start publishing essays. And his main essays at that time, his main ideological struggle was against the Narodniks, people's will, and their idea that capitalism was never coming to Russia, and therefore we should just do terrorism, right? Which was a stupid idea. He, in fact, argued that markets were entering into Russia, that capitalism was coming into Russia, and that Russia was ready for something greater than just random terroristic acts. Lenin would argue, quote unquote, Lenin would ultimately say that Lenin would argue and criticize them for only emphasizing the progressive sides of capitalism and for ignoring the contradictions of capitalism, the growing poverty, the ruin of the masses of the working people, the class interest of the proletariat. He would say Marxists should not be concerned with the markets for the bourgeois, but about the organizing the working class and about developing and consolidating the mass working class movement in Russia. And in fact, Lenin would both expertly shift the argument away from what is happening to what should be done, right? So through his essays, he would he would tell the movements, the socialist movements of St. Petersburg, that they're too focused on what Russia is becoming, right? Capitalist, peasant, yada, yada. He would argue that Russia is inevitably trending towards capitalism and commodity production. And that we should more so focus on what should be done, not what is happening. And what should be done is organizing the working class movement for a socialist revolution. Lenin would ultimately, through his essays and his involvement within the social democratic movements of St. Petersburg, would prove his excellent understanding of Marxism, and he would become a leader of the St. Petersburg Social Democrats. And in his ceaseless fights against Narodniks, Lenin would, even in this one funny instance in 1894, publicly debate and humiliate a famous Narodnik author, Vorontsov, who was having a public street lecture, right? So Vorontsov was giving a public street lecture, and Lenin would be in the crowd, and Lenin would begin arguing with Vorontsov. Constantly, he would start picking apart every single Narodnik idea, showing how stupid it was, showing how unscientific it was, showing how idealist it was. And Lenin would tear him apart so well that Vorontsov would step off the stool that he was preaching from. You know, he would humiliate him in front of hundreds of people that were all around, viewing him. With his, after, in 1894, arguing and putting Vorontsov down, in that famous street debate that sort of became semi-legendary in social democratic circles, amongst all the socialist kids. It wasn't well known, but, amongst the niche socialist kids in Russia, everybody knew about that legendary debate between Lenin and Vorontsov. Lenin would put a nail in the coffin of the Narodnik movement with his essay, What Are the Friends of the People? Or what the Friends of the People are. And he would criticize the liberal Narodniks this time. So the liberal Narodniks were a tangent of the Narodnik groups that were more focused on implementing in liberalism than socialism. And he would say that they were nothing more than a false friend of the masses who had given up on revolution and instead become liberals that were simply just representatives of the rural bourgeois. And Lenin would argue in that essay that the true path was the working class, whose goal wasn't implementing in capitalism, but to destroy it. That their main goal was to lead the movement and destroy both czarist autocracy and capitalism in order to build communism. And that their greatest ally, the proletariat's greatest ally in their main goal of destroying both czarist autocracy and capitalism would be the peasants. And so in that essay, Lenin pretty much laid out the scientific way in which revolution would be done in Russia. And he would turn out to be right in the annals of history. Marxism is a science. Theory is the hypothesis. Practice is the experiment. And if your experiment turns out to be right, then your hypothesis was right. If your experiment tends towards success, then your hypothesis was successful. That is the theoretical dialectical connection between theory and practice. It's a dance. Theory and practice are dances. And Lenin's theory would always be proven successful in that dance between theory and practice. Lenin would say, quote unquote, in his essay, "It is the working class that the social democrats rely on. When the advanced representatives of the class have mastered the ideas of scientific socialism, the Russian workers will rise at the head of all democratic elements, overthrow absolutism, and lead the Russian proletariat." This essay by Lenin would spread all over social democratic circles, and it would actually reach the hands of a young Stalin and introduce Stalin to Lenin for the first time. Lenin would start guiding the social democratic circles to agitate the masses, not just stay as a fringe group that was just reading by themselves, isolated, and start getting them to pass out leaflets, especially during labor strikes about workers' demands. And in the leaflets, Lenin would outline what the workers should be demanding. It was a way of guiding the working class. In 1894, Vladimir Ulyanov would go from Vladimir Ulyanov to Vladimir Lenin, because in 1894 he would finally adopt his legendary underground name, which was so common of revolutionaries who were constantly getting arrested in Russia at the time. You always had to have a cover-up name, and Lenin had several. But Lenin would become the one that stuck, and that name would be birthed in 1894. I'm sorry. In April 25th of 1895, Lenin would head to Switzerland, where he would make the acquaintances of darling Russian communist Plekhanov, and even make an agreement between his group of Social Democrats that Lenin was leading and Plekhanov's group of Social Democrats to come to an agreement. However, during their talks, there was also creeping on the horizon the acknowledgement that there was a difference, that Plekhanov and Lenin had different perspectives about their interpretations of Marxism, such as Plekhanov thinking that Marxists could work with liberals. And this divide, though small, Lenin believing that Marxists should guide the working class into overthrowing czarist autocracy and capitalism, Plekhanov thinking Marxists should work with liberals to implement in liberal democracy. This small little ideological divide would become a huge rupture later on as the Russian Revolution formated itself. But for now, in the 1890s, it was just a small little disagreement between friends. And so in 1895, Lenin would travel all across Europe, Western Europe, meeting various groups, observing the proletariat. And in 1895, he would even have a chance to meet a very elderly, dying Friedrich Engels. This was the last year that Friedrich Engels was alive. However, Engels, unfortunately, would be too sick to see Lenin. So this legendary meeting between the old Marxist, the representative of the old Marxist world, and Lenin, who was guiding Marxism into a new era, the era of imperialism, and that analysis of Marxism, that base of Marxism into the era of imperialism, that unfortunately never happened. But they were very close to meeting, as Lenin was in France. But Lenin would be close and meet many of Engels and Marx's acquaintances. He would meet Marx's son-in-law. And while in Western Europe, Engels would even die while Lenin was visiting and, being unfortunately unable to meet him on August 5th, 1895. And Lenin would write a beautiful obituary for Engels. And I highly recommend you search up Lenin's obituary for Engels. It's written when Lenin is still young, but it sort of encapsulates a lot of his growing ideas about the future of Marxism and all those things. So Lenin observed the working classes all across Western Europe and in Russia and in St. Petersburg itself. And through that observation, he came up with a hypothesis, right? He came up with theory. You observe the material world and you come up with theory. That's Marxist dogma. That's how you do Marxism. It's a science. It's a social science. You observe society and you come up with theories about it. It's almost like the scientific method applied to human societies. It's very much, Marx and Engels are the founders of sociology themselves and that whole branch of studies. And Lenin was ready, after observing how the working class movements were going about, to bring a strategy to Russia in 1902 that had never been seen before. And he would do that through publishing, through beginning to write What Is to Be Done. And so What Is to Be Done would be published in 1902, and it is a classic of Lenin. It is a foundational text of Marxist-Leninism. In that text, Lenin would highlight, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of it. Of course, go read it. And, this is not perfect, but he would highlight that, yes, alliances are important, but they should not be done in order to allow in liberalism and opportunists into communist movements. That communist calls for left unity often just allowed in liberals, opportunists, people who weren't real Marxists or had a bad understanding of Marxism. That alliances must be made carefully and with the ability to constantly criticize and remain independent from the people that you ally with. Alliances, scientifically, as Lenin has analyzed, alliances should always be temporary. Alliances with opposing ideological groups or groups that you have splits with, they should always be temporary. And you should always be allowed to remain independent and ideologically be able to criticize the people that you have an alliance with. In addition, Lenin, in his book, What is to be Done, would call for a disciplined vanguard party made up of professional revolutionaries who would guide the working class into revolution. Because the thing is, the working class itself cannot go into revolution. Cannot. If the working class is left to do revolution by itself, what it does is it forms trade unions. Those trade unions eventually become reformist and get incorporated into the state. Right? That is the most that the working class can ever do. And so we need professional revolutionaries to guide the working class to go beyond that trade union, liberal reformist movement and into revolution, into a true revolution that overthrows capitalism. Because the working class itself is divided. There's only a small section of the working class that is class conscious. The rest of the working class remains within, and this is Gramsci, he comes later, but within the capitalist hegemony. He would say that economists, social democrats who believe that the workers would magically liberate themselves, were wrong, that the natural tendency of workers was that trade union and to get incorporated into the state. And finally, he talked about setting up organizations everywhere that could be done through printing newspapers to reach the masses that could easily be substituted for internet blogs, YouTube videos, etc. today. And so Lenin's plan was to start the distribution process first, right? So it was to start printing a newspaper first before you had the party. And so through the newspaper, you could spread your ideas, you could spread your set up organizations, through local places as you distribute the newspaper, and then a party could form around the newspaper, around the ideas that you distributed. That was Lenin's plan. And, I think often we make fun of Trots for distributing and printing newspapers and holding on to them so much. But that newspaper idea started with Lenin. Before Lenin had a party, he started Iskra, the newspaper, and he started distributing it and forming organizations around the newspaper. The Bolsheviks were formed around the newspapers that Lenin printed and worked on printing. And so we can take this lesson. I know that there's already parties like FRSO or PSL, but we can take this idea and so easily apply it to the modern day with internet blogs, YouTube videos, things like that. We can modernize it. Lenin, thusly, through his newspaper printing, hoped to create a league of workers that would help organize the working class of St. Petersburg, issue leaflets, organize strikes, and they would start doing that immediately. They would start issuing leaflets, issuing newspapers, organizing strikes around St. Petersburg until the Tsarist authorities began cracking down on them. In December 8th, 1895. In December 8th, 1895, the Tsarist authorities caught wind of what Lenin and the Social Democrats were doing, that it was dangerous, and they began cracking down on them. In 1896, the St. Petersburg workers' strikes would happen, in which the working class of Russia would awaken a beast which had been sleeping. And that awakening of that beast in 1896 showed socialists that the Russian workers were ready for something greater, that they did have class consciousness, that socialism could be implemented within Russia. It was proof, those worker strikes in 1896, those mass worker strikes. During 1896, Lenin himself would be in prison. He got captured. His Social Democratic group got cracked down upon by the Tsarist authorities. But he would continue making propaganda as the protests were going on, writing leaflets, in addition to organizing his group the best he could in jail. And he would often have to do it secretly, of course. There's really funny stories of Lenin swallowing whole bottles of ink before the Tsarist authorities could find him writing letters secretly in prison. In prison, Lenin would also begin writing his other great work, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. Uh, he wouldn't finish it, but he would begin the research for it. And finally, on January 29th, 1897, Lenin would be sent to Siberia for exile, and he would spend 3 years in Siberia. Lenin would ultimately be sent to a small village in Siberia that was isolated called Shushenko, Shushenskoe. I'm so sorry to the Russians. And luckily for Lenin, in 1898, his sweetheart from his reading groups that he had met, Krupskaya, would move and also be deported to that small town in Siberia after she was caught also. So Lenin had met Krupskaya through the reading groups, the various reading groups in St. Petersburg, and they had quickly, hit off, fallen in love. She would become his partner throughout his life, Krupskaya. And in 1898, she would also get sent to where Lenin was from St. Petersburg after getting caught. Lenin would use his 3 years in Siberia to read Marxist theory extensively, write, and connect with exiled Marxists. And during that exile, he would even marry Krupskaya on July 10th, 1898. During his exile, Lenin would finish his book that he had started in prison, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. And in The Development of Capitalism in Russia, he would argue that the Narodniks and People's Will were in fact wrong. That Russia was ready for capitalism and for socialist revolution, that even in the peasant areas, the peasants were slowly but surely developing towards a form of capitalism. And that meant that revolution could happen in Russia, and therefore they should start fighting for a proletarian revolution instead of being these defeatists and these terrorists. While this Narodnik People's Will debate is not that important today, and the development of capitalism in Russia is not that relevant to modern day organizing, his analysis that the proletarian would lead the revolution, and that it would be the proletarian and only the proletarian that would lead the revolution, but they would do it in alliance with the peasants, could be seen as sort of a precursor to Maoism, where Mao would expand that and say, actually, the peasants can be a revolutionary class. So in that way, his idea is relevant. We don't really live in a world with peasants anymore, except in like isolated places overseas. But in America, we're a highly developed economy. We don't really have peasants. But you can sort of see the basic foundations of Maoism sort of becoming laid down in the foundation that Lenin sets, right? The idea that proletarians are the class that will rise up, that will lead the revolution, and they will do it in alliance with peasants, not without the peasants, not at the behest of peasants, but in alliance with the peasants. You can sort of see how Mao takes that idea and flips it on his head. It's kind of beautiful in that way. The dialectical, scientific process of Marxism, of theory, practice. During his exile, Bernstein, who was a German Marxist, would sort of found Bernsteinism. And Bernsteinism would gain popularity throughout the socialist movements of Europe, as would legal Marxism. Both Bernsteinism and legal Marxism hoped to achieve Marxism through parliamentary elections. Basically, they hoped that they could get Marxists elected within liberal democracies, and then those elected Marxists could somehow transform these liberal democracies into socialist countries. It's sort of where our modern-day understanding of social democrats begins, right? So Bernstein and Bernsteinism and the legal Marxists were calling themselves social democrats at the time, and eventually, they're what we conceptualize as social democrats today. But at that time, it meant communists. Lenin himself would read Bernstein's book while in exile, and he fucking hated it. Halfway through reading Bernstein's theory, he would start shouting about how stupid it is. Krupskaya records that that happened, and it's a very funny story. As Lenin's time in exile drew to a close, he began working on organizing social democratic party structures, like he analyzed they would have to do in his work, What is to be done. And upon release in 1900, Lenin would immediately set about to two Herculean tasks, two tasks that were immense and titanous: make connections with social democrats in order to set up a party, and more importantly, set up a newspaper that would be published outside of Russia so that they could avoid Tsarist crackdowns, Tsarist authorities, Tsarists coming in and wrecking the printing presses, and then distribute that newspaper that was being printed outside of Russia to avoid censors that would allow him to build up that base for setting up a party. And so that newspaper that he envisioned would be called Iskra, with its launching on July 16th, 1900. During this time, Lenin would also break from a number of other Marxists. Plekhanov, all the other social democrats, and he would head to Munich, Germany, to help found Iskra. Now, while Lenin would start fighting with Plekhanov, it wouldn't be a complete break. Plekhanov and a lot of the other social democrats that had these sort of liberal ideas would be on the editing board of Iskra. So I think that's important for you to know. But he would start butting heads with so many other social democrats in the communist movement of Europe. While newspapers are not that important today, in our time, it cannot be understood how important articles published by Iskra would be in shaping the working class movement of Russia at that time, especially as the working class movement in the late 1890s of Russia began kicking into high gear and started awakening this beast of worker strikes. The articles of Iskra, many of them being written by Lenin, would help guide social democratic organizations, help give strategies on what to do. They would just answer the smallest questions, the biggest questions. How should we organize? What should we do? What should we demand? It helped guide the working class. At that time, newspapers were everything. And so we cannot underestimate how big of an impact Iskra had on the working class movement of Russia at that time. Lenin in Iskra and constantly in his life, around all of his buddies and wherever he could, would emphasize not to fall into sporadic movements, but to constantly wage a never-ending struggle to resist the bourgeois ideas infiltrating working class movements. He would constantly warn people that the bourgeois ideas were infiltrating the communist movements. And so we had to constantly ideologically struggle both against the bourgeois and the bourgeois movements that were infiltrating the communist struggle in the form of people who call themselves communists, like Bernstein, and his ridiculous idea that you can vote in Marxism. Get the fuck out of here. Come on. Then, his answer to all of this sporadic movement would be to have a party consisting of professional revolutionaries, local organizers, and mass support. You cannot have this movement without mass support. You needed the mass support along with the vanguard party of revolutionary professionals. Mass support is so important, and they had to imbue themselves into the masses. They had to get themselves involved with the masses. Lenin would also warn that sporadic movements ultimately just allow in bourgeois ideas, which would lead to not the overthrow of capitalism, but the continuation of it under reformist movements. And so, these sporadic movements are these big protests that come out of nowhere. They don't really have a leadership. They don't really have an idea of what they're demanding. And they come out there and they say, fuck you, capitalism. And eventually what they end up doing is they get infiltrated. They don't really have an idea of what they're going to do. And they end up becoming reformist. They end up becoming imbued within the liberal state. Think about the 2008 Occupy Wall Street movement, or so many anarchist movements that have failed. Chaz in Seattle, right? This movement that's very sporadic, comes out of nowhere with no mass base, that's not full of, a vanguard revolutionary party that's disciplined, that are just saying, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. And they get very quickly infiltrated by liberalism. They really don't have a plan. And if you don't have a plan, you can't do a revolution, right? If you don't have a plan to guide people, you don't have a revolution there. All you have is reformism. And so that was what Lenin was warning people about in his articles, in his life at that time, in the 1900s. This was the ideological struggle that Lenin was taking at that time. Lenin would also carefully start choosing trusted leaders to form the party core and to spread Iskra under the nose of Tsarist authorities. And at that time, in the early 1900s, he would meet Stalin and choose him to start spreading Iskra around Georgia and the social democratic movement they had in Georgia. And so this would be the beginning of Stalin and Lenin's long alliance. And eventually Stalin taking over the Bolsheviks and the communist movement after Lenin's death. The newspaper Iskra and the infrastructure that it had within the local social democratic arenas all over Russia would be the basis in which Lenin would begin his movement and the Bolsheviks. However, in 1902, the distribution and printing of Iskra would become too dangerous, and Lenin and Krupskaya would have to move from Germany to London because the German authorities began cracking down on it. And so Lenin and Krupskaya would have to live in London from 1902 to 1903. Printing Iskra would also have Lenin continue to butt heads with other prominent social democrats, including Plekhanov, on the role of the proletariat and the peasants. Lenin would think that the best strategy is an alliance between the peasants and the proletariat, with the proletariat leading. And that disagreement with him and Plekhanov, who thought that the best strategy would be to make an alliance with the liberals and put in a capitalist revolution, allow the liberals to take power, not the Marxists, would lead to eventually them breaking. But for now, they were working together on Iskra. This disagreement would also be on the need for the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Plekhanov didn't think was needed, but Lenin did. And the dictatorship of the proletariat is just when the working class yields the tools of the state to repress its class enemies. So I'll give you a basic course in case you don't understand this. Marxists basically believe that the state is a tool of class rule, right? So the police, the army, these things are the state, and they are a tool of class rule. In fact, the state arises from class contradiction. You have a class at the top, a class at the bottom. The class at the top needs to maintain its power, so it forms a government, a state around itself. And so Lenin said, we need to form a dictatorship of the proletariat. We need to go from a dictatorship of the bourgeois, which is what capitalism is, in which the state is controlled by the capitalists, the 1%, and utilize the state for the 99% to suppress its enemies, the 1%, the bourgeois. And so that is the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? It doesn't mean dictatorship in the way that we understand it. Dictatorship back then meant something else. It means a democracy for workers. It is a better democracy, in fact, than the liberal democracies, because the liberal democracy ultimately are controlled by the bourgeois, by the 1%. They are dictatorships of the bourgeois. And so true democracy is in the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that's what Lenin argued was needed. And Plekhanov didn't believe that was needed. He thought that Marxists should just let the liberals take power of the government and sit by. By 1902, Lenin's Iskra proposals for how parties should organize and programs should be done, and answers to even the smallest things like how national minorities should be organized within Russia, with Lenin arguing that Marxists should be in favor of nationalism of all these oppressed national minorities in Russia against Tsarism and the right for them to self-rule. So, a basis for how national minorities would be treated later on in the USSR. began to get accepted by social democratic organizations all across Russia because they were all receiving Iskra and these articles by Lenin. And he eventually started preparing for the Second Congress of the Party of Social Democrats in 1903, where they would try to hammer out all the ideological differences that the communist movement had gotten by that time. In the Second Congress, which would be held in London, there would be a fierce struggle, with Lenin arguing for his disciplined vanguard party headed by professional revolutionaries to lead the masses. The other side would say that we should opt for a legalistic orthodox Marxism, that Russia had to first establish a capitalistic liberal democracy before it could do socialism. And so this ugly break in terms of strategies for how to do revolution, with the other side arguing that we should just form an alliance with the capitalists, let the capitalists take the state and overthrow the czarist autocracy, with Marxists not doing much after that, just give them the keys to power, would lead to an ugly break in the Second Congress. And this Second Congress would lead to the formation of the Bolsheviks, which would follow Lenin's line of the vanguard disciplined party, and the Mensheviks, which would be composed of Plekhanov and all the other legalist Marxists. Lenin would also be kicked out by Iskra because it had Menshevik editors, and this split would reverberate throughout the Russian world. While this split was small at the time, the Menshevik-Bolshevik split would become huge later on in the revolution. Stalin, upon hearing about the Bolshevik-Menshevik split, would immediately be on the side of the Bolsheviks. Trotsky, however, would continue to be a Menshevik. Even during the party congress, the Second Party Congress, he would accuse Lenin of trying to implement a dictatorship. And so, so often we're told that Trotsky is the true inheritor of Lenin. Trotsky was never really that loyal of a Bolshevik. Stalin was loyal of a Bolshevik from the beginning. Trotsky always was sort of adjacent to the Bolsheviks. He always had his own radical group that would come into alliance with the Bolsheviks and then not come into alliance with the Bolsheviks. He would always be an adjacent Bolshevik. And this was sort of emblematic of that. With Iskra now being controlled by the Mensheviks, they would immediately start attacking Lenin. The newspaper that Lenin used to write for would immediately start attacking him and his tendencies. And the central committees of the Social Democrats, which was controlled by the Mensheviks, and even the Central International, which was captured by the Mensheviks, would isolate and kick out the Bolsheviks. And so the Bolsheviks were now isolated from the Second International. The Second International was the international hub of all European communist parties, and the Mensheviks. So it was not a good time for the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were completely isolated from all other communist socialistic groups. And being isolated, Lenin would fire back on these attacks against him with the article, "One step forward, two steps back." And in it, he would say that in its struggle for the power, the proletariat has no other weapon but organization. Disunited by the rule of anarchic competition in the bourgeois world, ground down by forced labor for capital, constantly thrust to the lower depths of utter destitution, savagery, and degeneration, the proletariat can and inevitably will become an invincible force only through the ideological unification on the principles of Marxism being reinforced by the material unity of organization, which wields millions of toilers into an army of the working class. Neither the senile rule of the Russian autocracy nor the senescent rule of the international capital will be able to withstand this army. And so Lenin, in that article, talked back to the haters, said that his ideas were right, and this is how we're going to do revolution, not your way. And history would begin entering a new stage, which would allow Lenin to prove himself right. In 1904, as the Russo-Japanese War would begin in February of that year, and mass unrest would begin fomenting in Russia as Russia began losing that war, and all the ugly contradictions of Tsarist society became bubbling to the surface. During the Russo-Japanese War, the Bolsheviks would need to start organizing and laying down the groundwork. Despite being isolated and moved from everybody else, they would start doing just that in the Third Party Congress to form the Bolshevik plans. And so in the Third Party Congress of the Social Democrats, the Bolsheviks, made up of entirely Bolsheviks, would try to form their next plan for what to do with the Russo-Japanese War. On the break of the Russo-Japanese War, Lenin predicted that the rot of Tsarist society would begin to bubble up, and that the Russo-Japanese War represented an era of great change in Russia. And he was absolutely right. Lenin, who was in Geneva at the time, watching all of this happen from the sidelines, not in Russia, was irked to see history happen, while he was away. And while he was away, the revolution of 1905 would happen in Russia, in which, forced by mass protests because of the failures of the Russo-Japanese War and the armed uprising of sailors on the Potemkin and Bloody Sunday, where peaceful protesters would be killed by Tsarist police, the Tsar would be forced to partially abdicate power and implement in a liberal government. And so now liberalism had come to Russia. The time for Lenin's ideas were right, and yet he was so far away in Geneva. And we'll continue this story next time. Thank you so much for listening. Hello, fellas. Welcome to part 2 of The Life of Lenin. If you did not catch part 1, highly recommend you go back and catch it, just to get people's memories working, jogging a little bit. Last time we left Lenin, he had just separated himself from the broader European communist movement completely by forming the Bolsheviks and creating the Bolshevik-Menshevik split. The main ideological differences between the two and the broader European socialist movement at the time was that the Bolsheviks believed that socialist revolution could happen in a feudalistic economy like Russia, which was a semi-feudalistic economy, and that it was the duty of communists to guide the workers to overthrow Tsarist autocracy and capitalism. Meanwhile, the broader socialist movement, communist movement in Europe believed that revolution could not happen in a Tsarist autocracy whatsoever, that it was impossible, and that, in fact, you had to implement in liberalism, that Marxists had to work with liberals, let liberals take the helms of government, and that was the only way to do socialist revolution, let them implement in liberalism and capitalism to Russia to form a base for socialism. And so these are the two tendencies that are fighting each other. And this split completely isolates Lenin. He is isolated from the Second International, which is the hub for all European socialists. He is isolated from the broader social democratic movement, the Bolsheviks from the Mensheviks. And he is even kicked out of Iskra, which is a newspaper that he helped found to spread socialist ideas, communist ideas all over Russia. And so Lenin is in Germany when in 1905, during the midst of the Russo-Japanese War, and Russia is losing horribly, after Bloody Sunday, after big revolts, after a big railroad strike that completely paralyzed Russia, the revolution in 1905 would happen. Well, Lenin's in Germany, Geneva, Germany. I believe Geneva is in Switzerland. Sorry. So American of me. But Geneva, Switzerland. Well, Lenin is in Geneva, Switzerland. The revolution in 1905 happens, and the Tsarist autocracy is forced to implement in a semi-liberal government under a Duma. And so Suddenly, the door's open. If liberalism can come into Russia, so can socialism, so can communism. And the fact that the Russian proletariat is revolutionary proves that everybody was wrong, that there is something more to this proletariat. And so that's where we find ourselves. Lenin stuck in Switzerland watching this from afar. In the Third Congress, the Bolsheviks' plans would be hammered out, right? And they would ultimately come to the affirmation that they would engage in violent armed insurrection, that was their ultimate end goal. But they would, for the time, because it was too early, you cannot rush these things. It has to come at the right time. They would try to get elected into as many committees as they could in the liberal government. But that wouldn't be their ultimate goal. Their ultimate goal would be violent armed insurrection. But if need be, you can get elected, you can organize within these networks in order to spread your message. Lenin would continue to plan an armed revolution from afar, though, from Geneva. He would keep on making revolutionary slogans, he would keep on hammering out party plans. And in 1905, he would even start getting some gun networks figured out for the future. Finally, for a short time in 1905, Lenin would return to St. Petersburg. As the new liberal government that the Tsar had instituted allowed some political freedoms. But soon, he would be forced to move back to Finland because government crackdowns began immediately afterwards. Whatever liberal freedoms they gave, they took away just as fast. And finally, Lenin would end up back in Geneva, Switzerland. For the Mensheviks, the revolution was basically done. They had gotten the Duma, and the Mensheviks started just demanding that the workers stop rising up. Everything had been gotten, whatever they wanted. The Duma was the Congress that the Tsar allowed to operate, basically. So it was an elected Congress. That was his concession. He would allow the workers to have a Duma that they could elect representatives in. And so for the Mensheviks, it was over. The revolution in 1905 was the only revolution. But the Bolsheviks would say that there's so much more, that this is just the beginning of the revolution. One thing during the revolution in 1905 that caught the eyes of Lenin was that for a little bit, temporarily, Soviets started popping up all around Russia. And a Soviet is just a local council set up in cities by workers, soldiers, etc., that would sort of be its own government, right? So it created a secondary dual power to the predominant Tsarist regime. And even though they would end up getting crushed by the Tsarist state during the revolution in 1905, they were in their infancy, it gave Lenin an idea that the workers were ready for something more. Mensheviks looked at the Soviets and they said they represented nothing. They ignored what the Soviets represented, which was a monumentous new era, a possibility. In 1905, hearing the demands of the people, engaging the situation, Mensheviks and Bolsheviks would enter into a very, very shaky alliance and would unite the social democratic movement at the time. Remember, social democratic at that time meant communist, not what we have come to know social democratic in our modern day lingo. And this alliance, Lenin emphasized, would still allow them to criticize the Bolsheviks and remain independent from them. And this alliance was very, very shaky. With constant infighting, Lenin would even get sued for defamation by the Bolsheviks at one point, though that trial would go nowhere. Lenin would continue to see the Duma, however, ultimately, even though they did try to work within it, as a fake front, and would keep on trying to organize workers and peasants outside of it. Lenin would predict that the first Duma, which was very open, very liberal, had very free elections, would be gotten rid of. That Tsar's autocracy was working with a contradiction. This old system of feudalism with this new system of capitalism. And these two systems, this old nobility system with this burgeoning bourgeois class, in this contradictory society where these, like, all these forces were trying to just vibe for power, was going to rip eventually, right? You know, it was, Russia was trying to hold an immense contradictions at that time. And so Lenin predicted that the Second State Duma would get dissolved, and it turned out to be true. The revolution of 1905's hopes would die under mass czarist repressions of social democrats, revolutionaries, and anybody who challenged the state. Lenin would have to move the Bolsheviks to participate in the third one, but only as a means of spreading revolutionary propaganda. You know, so the Second Duma would go away. That one would also get cracked down on for being too quote-unquote free. Then a third one would come out. And in that, Lenin would have the Bolsheviks participate in it, even though it was bullshit, just to spread revolutionary propaganda, organize the workers, things like that. Likewise, Lenin, in conjunction with Rosa Luxemburg, would push for a strategy that socialists would try to stop their countries from entering the oncoming World War I, as World War I was coming onto the horizon. But if World War I did happen, and if their country did go into World War I, that they would utilize that moment for revolutionary defeatism. That they would turn their country's entry into World War I into an actual civil war, in which they would try to destroy their own governments under a socialist revolution. Finally, in December of 1907, after laying down all this groundwork, after organizing so much, Lenin would be forced by Tsarist authorities to flee Russia once again, heading back to Geneva, Switzerland. 1907 would be a year of dark, dark reaction, as all workers' progress that had been made by Social Democrats would be rolled back. The workers' movement and the strikes, things like that, the power of the workers' movement would lose steam itself. And Tsarist brutal crushing would come to dominate Russia again. But Lenin wouldn't lose hope. In fact, he got a second gust of energy, as he would set about the creation of a new newspaper. Remember, Lenin got kicked out of Iskra, and newspapers were vital to his strategy. It was print the newspapers and guide people first. Then set up the party after that. Set up the party around the newspaper. And newspapers, of course, were a lot more important back then. We can substitute this with YouTube videos, with blogs, with things like that. And to begin waging an ideological struggle against revisionist Marxist tendencies, which had taken over Marxism at the time. Lenin would also begin studying the failures of 1905 in order to figure out how to do revolution better next time, and he would come to the following conclusions. 1, the revolution had failed because the working class lacked serious organizing, and it had been a sporadic revolution. 2, working class's demands should have been the complete overthrow of the destruction of the Tsarist system. 3, there needed to be a greater alliance between peasants and proletarians. Meanwhile, during this time, the best the Mensheviks were arguing for was to get back freedom of speech from the Tsar. So while the Tsar's crushing everybody, while the Tsar's getting rid of rights, while the Tsar's absolutely rolling back whatever gains the workers made from the revolution in 1905 in Russia, all the Mensheviks are asking for is not, let's overthrow the Tsar. Let's get his fucking ass. All they can say is, please, can the God, the Emperor, give us freedom of speech again, Mr. Sir? You know, it's pathetic. It's fucking pathetic. I'm sorry. You know, the Mensheviks are a long dead socialist movement, and I'm insulting them in childish ways. But fuck them. Honestly, fuck them. I don't care. Fuck the Mensheviks. What is this liberal bullcocky bullshit of begging your oppressor for a crumb? Kill the motherfucker and get the bread. Stop begging for him to toss you a crumb. You know, I'm sorry. Anyways, moving on. Stolypin, Stoylpin, I'm so sorry, I butchered his name, would come to power under the Duma and bring a dark Tsarist reaction. Peter Stolypin would also throw millions of peasants off their lands through privatization, hoping that through breaking up the peasant communes, peasants at this time had like this pseudo-socialistic culture where they would commonly own land. That was called the peasant commune. Stolypin, who was now the new oppressive head of the Duma, hoped that by breaking up the peasant commune and creating a kulak class that would buy the land that the peasants were thrown off of, he would create this new class of these semi-rich peasants that would strengthen the Tsarist regime. Given all of these contradictions, Russia was screeching at this time with contradictions, this nobility trying to keep the cap on top of this both liberal capitalist tiger of liberal freedoms and also socialist demands. It was all hell breaking loose. It was trying to twine it together, but the box was breaking. Pandora's box was about to be opened. So given all this, Lenin saw revolution as inevitable, as the class contradictions heightened, with him proposing a strategy that I think was so excellent and shows the genius of Lenin. He proposed the strategy of both legal struggle through democratic socialists that were elected in the Duma and underground strategy at the same time to bring down the autocracy. So both legalistic front and an underground front. Lenin would need to hammer out his plan, however, with the rest of the Bolsheviks in the Fifth Congress in Paris in 1910. Because remember, the Bolsheviks are not very united. Even though they are somewhat united around this split between them and the Mensheviks, they also represent a wide array of ideas, from Bukharin to Trotsky, Stalin. The Bolsheviks have a wide array of ideological diversity, and you need to hammer out these things, and so they do. He would have to fight tendencies in the Bolsheviks through members that wanted to completely liquidate their entire party and join the Mensheviks in the Duma, since they still had a shaky alliance with the Mensheviks in the Duma at that time. Lenin would manage to get most of the Bolsheviks on board in order to get on with his program of legalistic struggle and underground struggle. However, while he was doing this, Trotsky, under his nose, would actually try to form a secret bloc within the Bolsheviks that were in favor of liquidation of the Bolsheviks, of joining with the Mensheviks. And they would slowly start vetoing a lot of Lenin's proposed plans, including managing to get his newspaper Proletarii shut down. So this secret bloc that Trotsky was forming really became a big issue for Lenin. And Lenin, during this time, even began calling Trotsky Judas. Judas, the character from the Bible who betrayed Jesus. Judas Trotsky. There's a funny story from Lenin's stay in Paris where he's at the home of a fellow Bolshevik, Georgy Solomon. And Lenin it's night. They've come back from a night out on the town, and Lenin is in his underwear. He's comfortable. He's completely naked in his underwear. And Georgy Solomon is getting ready for bed, but Lenin's so much energy. He's a very energetic guy. Energetic little cute guy. And Lenin's in his underwear, and he's pacing back and forth. And he gets into an argument with Gregory Solomon on the stance of the Bolsheviks being in the Duma, with Gregory Solomon saying we should just get out of the Duma. Why are we wasting time in the Duma? And this argument gets into such a big blowout, such a big, huge argument, that Gregory Solomon's feelings get hurt. Like Gregory Solomon is on the edge of tears. And seeing that he said too much, seeing that he's gone too far, Lenin gives Gregory Solomon a big old man hug in his underwear at night in Gregory Solomon's room, in his apartment in Paris. And he says he was only talking about theory. He didn't mean to hurt Solomon as a person. So I think both of all, first of all, that's a beautiful homoerotic story about Lenin. But also I think beautifully describes Lenin. He was a man who was always looking for ideological purity, for the true path, the path that was the most scientific, the most materialistic, the most likely to succeed, the most realistic. He wasn't a man who allowed people to get by on wrong, quote-unquote, false ideas. He was a man who always waged ideological struggle, even if that meant fighting people who were close to him. He never let anybody say anything wrong, quote-unquote, as on Marxist is a term that is. During this time, the Bolsheviks would get another blow to their stance, however, because the Second International, the global organization of socialists and communists all over Europe, would begin to court Menshevik ideas. So the Mensheviks would begin to control the Second International. And Lenin would begin to see the Second International and the global working class movement itself getting infiltrated by petit bourgeois ideas. Ideas about liberal trade unions, which eventually become reformist and, eventually end up getting incorporated into the state. Ideas of reformism through electoral politics. And he would use his own position within the international at any Second International meeting that he could. Whenever the Second International held congresses, Lenin was a member, to constantly criticize these Trotskyist trends and defend his fellow German comrade Rosa Luxemburg. Lenin in the 1910s would open a flurry of newspapers, too many to name. And the working class movement in Russia, after having gone through a lull, after having lost its steam in 1910, would begin to pick up steam again, start to get that fire again. Even as Stolypin, the leader of the Duma, was repressing and bringing in Tsarist autocracy, it started creating a reaction, a back and forth, and the workers' movement of Russia began becoming more militant. And so his repressions were having the exact opposite effect that he hoped that they would have. As the Bolshevik Party began to grow, workers would start joining the party en masse. En masse. Lenin would even have to set up a school for socialism in 1911 to educate all these new Marxists who were coming in to become professional revolutionaries that understood the basic cores of socialism and communism. In 1911, Lenin would wage his final struggle against the people that wanted to dissolve the Bolsheviks and become completely incorporated into the Mensheviks. Because in 1911, Lenin would have the Bolsheviks divorce from the Mensheviks in their alliance. As a class struggle heightened in Russia, that alliance was no longer needed as strongly. Now, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks would continue to work on and off again, but this was a big deal because Lenin and the Bolsheviks finally recognized that they no longer needed the shaky alliance with the Mensheviks, that the Mensheviks, who thought that the revolution in 1905 was good enough and that all we need now is just to ask the Tsar for freedom of speech, please, and a little bit more liberal freedoms, was no longer needed. That revolution was needed. That the revolution in 1905 was not finished, and we were going to finish the job that the revolution in 1905 failed to do. With the Bolsheviks now fully independent, they would launch a legalistic struggle through their newspaper Pravda. Pravda would be headed by Stalin, who had just been elected to the new Central Committee, and Lenin would move to Austria to be closer to the scenes in Russia, to be closer to the political movement in Russia. In 1912, striking mine workers in Lena would be shot down by Tsarist authorities. It would be called the Lena Massacre. And the working class movement would rear up its head once again. This would mobilize the workers of Russia into a fury, so similar to Bloody Sunday, you could say. The Bolsheviks, however, were isolated at this time. They were isolated from the Second International, which sort of represented the global socialist movement, more so the socialist movement in Europe, but, basically. And the Mensheviks, but he had full support in his party. Lenin's party completely supported him. And, the Bolsheviks were gaining support among the Russian masses slowly but surely. The Third State Duma would fall to the Fourth State Duma, and with those elections coming, Lenin would push all efforts towards getting some Bolsheviks elected into it, and would succeed in getting a couple Bolsheviks, a couple handfuls of delegates within the Duma. No means a large amount, but enough to show that the Bolsheviks were becoming something serious. The main goal of the 6 members that would get elected to the Duma would not be to pass pro-workers laws, but to constantly remind the working class that it was alive, to promote the working class struggle in the arena of politics, and to scare the bourgeois. That was the goal that Lenin took within legalistic means. It wasn't to get in there, become reformist, become, Bernie Sanders. It was to overthrow the system, to work within the system, to create a system, a network, an alliance, get it from the spotlight, to spread ideas in order to completely destroy the system. It wasn't to get in there, get a universal health care passed, and then sit on your ass after that. In Austria, Lenin would continue to hammer out party ideological struggles, the party line, and he would lead and write articles for the various newspapers they had. They had too many. God, the Bolsheviks loved fucking newspapers. For the party for 2 years. But this period of slowly building up and figuring out things and getting the ideological line down would be broken in the month of August 1914. Because in the month of August 1914, World War I broke out. With the outbreak of World War I, Lenin would be arrested by the Austrian police, who accused him of being an agent of Russia. And he would be forced to move to Switzerland, where he would remain until 1917. Lenin's understanding of World War I is that it was an inter-imperialist war. Capitalism, which is built off of competition, which means winners and losers, eventually leads within a country to winners forming monopolies. After these monopolies win the fight on their home front, let's say, the monopoly wins in Britain, they start fighting, these capitalist monopolies start fighting abroad for domination of markets. And we call this imperialism, when these monopolies, which also combine with finance capital, which is banking, start fighting abroad, conquering people, dividing territories, things like that. Well, eventually Europe did that, and Europe came to control the whole world. There was nowhere else left to conquer. They had conquered all of Africa, Asia, Middle East. There was nothing left for Europe to conquer. And so what was Europe left to do? Their monopoly capitalists had conquered the whole world. And so there was nothing left to do but fight each other, to re-divide the world. And so after dividing and conquering the whole world with no territories left to conquer, the European powers would turn on each other to re-divide the world, to see who would get the spoils of all these colonies in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. And so that would be Austria-Hungary and Germany as the central powers, and Great Britain, France, and Russia as the Entente. As the war began, the Second International and almost all major socialist groups supported World War I and their countries in World War I. That was how ideologically corrupt the communist movement was at the time. Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg were absolutely horrified. The Bolsheviks were one of the few defeatist groups, one of the few groups that were revolutionary defeatists that wanted to turn their wars, the World War I, into a civil war in their own countries against their bourgeois. And Rosa Luxemburg and her party would be one of the other few revolutionary defeatist groups. With this, Lenin would propose the foundation of a third international, that the Second International was dead, and there was a need for a third international. And he wouldn't get it until years later, but that idea really stayed important to him. 1914 would be a difficult year for the Bolsheviks. Several prominent Bolsheviks under the new war, World War I meant more repression of Tsarist autocracy, would get arrested. Party factions would get crushed, and the party would be left with narrow funds. They were only left with a couple $100 by 1914. 1914 would see the Bolshevik organizing go completely underground because Tsarists were crushing everything. But by this time, the Bolsheviks had sort of perfected underground organizing, newspaper distribution, so they adapted to the conditions well. They knew how to organize perfectly outside of the law. Lenin, with the collapse of the Second International, would also continue with the need to found the Third International that was not infiltrated by liberalism. And he would try to make connections all across Europe with various socialist groups to form the Third International. And this would lead to the Zimmerwald Conference in 1915, made up of socialist parties all across Europe, invited by Lenin. With the outbreak of World War I, Lenin recognized that capitalism had entered a new period and set himself to furiously study and observe and write. And in 1916, he would change the communist movement forever by publishing Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which brought Marxism to a new analysis, far beyond that of Marx and Engels, into the age of imperialism, which capitalism had entered into after Marx and Engels' death. As Lenin would put it in his book, quote, "Imperialism is capitalism in that stage of development in which the domination of monopolies and finance capital has established itself, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world amongst international trusts has begun, in which the partition of all territories of the globe among the great capitalist powers has been completed." Lenin would also lay the foundations of the ideas of the labor aristocracy. It was a burgeoning idea, but it was the idea that the workers within the imperialist countries benefited from imperialism and became lieutenants of their own bourgeois. That workers within imperialist core countries like Europe actually, paradoxically, because of the benefits gotten by colonialism, became soldiers of their own rich men, their own bourgeois, as proletarian. With this work, Lenin would also skillfully take down Kautsky's ideas of ultra-imperialism, because at that time there was this idea of ultra-imperialism in which Kautsky would propose that imperialism was actually good, that these countries would eventually reach peace and end war through imperialism, and that after dividing the world, they were actually laying down the foundations for a socialist world. And therefore, we could reform capitalism internally to make it socialist through getting people elected and bullshit. Lenin would argue that monopoly capitalism actually heightened the contradictions and made war more likely between imperialist powers and made it inevitable. And that was what we were seeing with World War I, just capitalist powers who had divided up the world, monopoly finance capital, redividing the world, trying to redivide the world. Lenin would get another win by further expanding his program of revolutionary defeatism in the Second Zimmerwald Congress. So the Zimmerwald Congress would adopt a lot of Lenin's ideas in 1916 against Kautsky as socialists. And the Zimmerwald Congress would represent socialist parties all across Europe. So his plans for a Third International were birthing. With World War I raging on, Lenin would expertly expand Marxism into the age of imperialism. And he would also expertly explain the right of the self-determination of nations, which was beginning to gain steam at the time, with Woodrow Wilson even himself proclaiming similar things, though he never followed suit with it. He would expound that the world is divided now into two types of nations: oppressor nations, which represented the minority, and oppressed nations, which constituted the majority, and that it was the majority's right to self-determination that was the goal of socialists in the oppressor nations to make happen. So basically what Lenin said was that if you were in an oppressed nation, if you were in a colonized nation, you had a right to self-determination. And the job of a socialist within Great Britain was to fight for the right for self-determination of the people of India. It was to fight against your own empire. I think that's kind of beautiful. The Zimmerwald Conference and his hopes for a Third International, however, would kind of collapse in front of his face, as Kautskyist ideas and right-wing opportunists would start making leeway within that Congress and start ripping it apart, forcing Lenin to start from square one once again, isolated from the global European socialist movement. In 1917, however, a year after he published Imperialism, the High Stage of Capitalism, Lenin began sensing a slowdown to World War I, as the war had exhausted all these countries, and that many countries were entering an era of revolution. You could sort of see the wind happening. And his sense would ultimately be right, as one of the weakest links in the chain of imperialism, his own native Russia, would break out into a second revolution in the month of May of 1917, as the workers of Petrograd took power into their own hands and formed their own workers' governments called Soviets. So in May of 1917, Petrograd, which is a city in Russia, would see a mass movement of workers, of soldiers, taking the government into their own hands and forming Soviets, forming their own government made up of workers. Lenin was watching this afar in Western Europe, but he immediately began to call for all power to the Soviets, because he saw the Soviets as representing the true will of the Russian people, as opposed to the provisional government, which was mostly just a farce. Lenin, however, was stuck in Germany at that time, watching the revolution happen from afar, and he would itch to return to Russia. And so he would quickly strike a deal through some connections he had with Swiss working class movements and with the German state to be able to go penalty-free through Germany, with Germans even giving Lenin and a number of political Russian exiles a train card that was politically immune and wouldn't get checked as they moved to Russia. The Germans themselves were more than happy to sow chaos into their enemy in World War I, which was Russia. So on April 9th, 1917, Lenin and his fellow revolutionaries would leave Germany, with him arriving in Russia 7 days later. As Lenin arrived in Petrograd for the first time in years, his native Russia, he was met by scores of cheering workers outside his train. Men would push to carry him on his shoulder. Lenin would walk to the square to deliver a speech to the crowd surrounding him with the red flags. And his first few words within Russia would be, "Long live the socialist revolution." Lenin would deliver his famous April thesis to Mensheviks and Bolsheviks in the All-Russian Congress of the Soviets, in which Lenin would expound that the Soviets were set up by the workers of Petrograd, and they now exercise dual power. They exercise their own government outside of the government currently, and that they represented the true will of the workers. And now the goal was to put power into the hands of the Soviets and not the provisional government, which represented a dictatorship of the bourgeois, and continued World War I uselessly, killing hundreds of thousands of Russian men for no reason. Lenin would also propose the Bolsheviks winning the majority in the Soviet to convince the workers to overthrow the provisional government, as the Soviet was not quite there yet to be that revolutionary. It was still controlled by Mensheviks. The workers were still not ready for that armed, violent revolution. And you can't strike too early. You have to be very careful. And so during these trying times, this is where we sort of get that dual face of Lenin, right? Lenin was always analyzing things as they moved along, always coming up with new strategies as was needed, as was materially needed on that ground. And then after Lenin's death, we look back and we see Lenin explaining this strategy in this certain time, that we need to do this at this certain time. And it sort of becomes, oh, Lenin always believed that. And this was Lenin's universal idea. No. During the revolution, Lenin constantly changed his strategies as needed. The Bolsheviks now had a plan on how to push Russia and win Russia from capitalism to socialism and to complete that revolution of 1905. And this plan would slowly but surely win over the masses. It would be to do popular slogans such as "all power to the Soviets." It would be to, slowly but surely win over the Soviet, to be revolutionary. And it would be to do all of these kinds of things, to continue to agitate, to put all power into the Soviets, slowly but surely. Lenin would also propose during the 1917 to change the name from Social Democrats to Communists, because Social Democrat has sort of become a dead term. Lenin would also have to balance his strategy with the needs and wants of his party and the masses, because the masses at this time were not ready for this revolutionary put all power to the Soviets. Lenin would, of course, relent to this, saying that the conditions weren't ripe yet, and it was a waiting game, slowly but surely building up power to let the Soviets take all the power from the provisional government. Lenin and the Bolsheviks would kick organizing into high gear, publishing articles, giving speeches wherever they could all across Russia. On July 1st, 500,000 workers would march under the banners of the Bolsheviks. Their works had started to pay off, and in late July, sensing that they were in deep trouble, the provisional government began to crack down on the Bolsheviks, their party meetings, printing presses, even spreading the rumor that Lenin was a German agent, quote-unquote. The Bolsheviks once again would have to go underground. It was a dark time of reaction against the Bolsheviks, who had just gotten so popular and had a plan for revolution, which was to put power into the Soviets. Lenin would even receive an arrest warrant from some groups, and some groups would seek to kill him. So he would have to flee from August to Finland temporarily while the heat died down on him. After July of 1917, that would be the last month of peace in the Russian Revolution, as the pendulum of the revolution would swing temporarily towards the provisional government, taking the majority of the state power away from the Soviet. As the Shaky Alliance would end, it would begin repressing communists and workers. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, following this state repression, would conclude that the time for armed revolution was now, especially as the Mensheviks began supporting the Tsarist state, cracking down on the Bolsheviks and cracking down on the workers' movement and trying to take back its power. While in hiding, Lenin would also publish his classic, The State and the Revolution. And I'll summarize The State and the Revolution sort of a little bit, but you should go read it. And in that, he would expound that the Marxist idea of revolutionary proletarian vanguard would take the state and implement in a dictatorship of the proletariat. Basically, he would formulate the earliest ideas that a socialist society is a society in which the workers, under a disciplined vanguard party, utilize the state being a tool of class rule, for its own rule, to suppress its class enemies, which are the bourgeois. Whereas under a dictatorship of the bourgeois, the state as a tool of class rule suppresses the proletariat, which is the workers. Lenin also would formulate the earliest ideas of what a socialist society could do. Just a couple of plans, such as the nationalization of banks, monopolies, corporations, and the organization of cooperative society. On August 25th, 1917, the provisional government would be placed under a military dictatorship of General Kornilov, who would begin to crush whatever gains had been made even by the revolution of 1905 and try to implement back in Tsarism. This power grab by Kornilov would frighten the Mensheviks, and he would even force the Mensheviks, who had previously supported the Tsarist government cracking down on the Bolsheviks, to get back into a temporary alliance with the Bolsheviks to help defeat Kornilov. And so the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, together working, would defeat Kornilov's military dictatorship, derising the masses of the workers and the soldiers to reject the Kornilov dictatorship and send General Kornilov fleeing from Russia. With Kornilov defeated, the working class now had full confidence, and Lenin in late September put forward a new plan. The time was now. The defeat of General Kornilov had taught the proletariat that they had confidence, that they had power. The Bolsheviks had to seize power now, in late September of 1917. And so the plans would be sent out to all Bolshevik groups to prepare for the violent overthrow of the government, Lenin himself spending time organizing with workers and talking to them as much as possible. The plan of the insurrection was to strike fast, to gain control of major things like telephone exchanges, telegraph offices, railroads, bridges, and to crush the lifeblood, the bloodstream of Russia. And so on November 6th, which in the Tsar's calendar is October 24th, Bolshevik troops would gather and position themselves in the city of Smolny, Smolny, to meet those previously dispersed provisional government troops. And they would begin fighting government troops. By early November 7th, which was October 25th in the Tsarist calendar, all telegraph offices, railroads, bridges, radio stations, and even the Winter Palace were taken by the Bolsheviks. And they had even captured the most important government offices in the city of Petrograd. At 10 a.m., Lenin proclaimed that the provisional government was done and that all power had been given to the Soviets. The Bolsheviks had won. That evening, Lenin went to the Congress of the Soviets and received a standing applause, one that did not stop for such a long time that he wasn't able to speak. They had won. They were doing their victory rounds. Humanity had entered into a new era, the dictatorship of the proletariat. A Pandora's box had been opened in which a new system was possible, far beyond the bounds of capitalism. A system that worked for the proletariat, the 99%, a system in which there was no homelessness, in which workers controlled the means of production. And now there was no going back, especially for the colonized of the world who looked onto Russia as a new shining star for what their countries could achieve outside of neocolonialism and what capitalism had to offer. During the first few months of the new Soviet government, the Bolsheviks would work to codify the issues that the war had caused, because World War I had completely ravaged Russian society. And they began to prepare for a growing counter-reaction. They did not have full power yet. And that counter-reaction would begin to grow and come in January 14, as bullets would be fired onto Lenin's car by terrorists. Lenin would, of course, make it out unscathed. But that reaction, that counter-revolution of Tsarism, of capitalism, of the bourgeois was growing. They would not take the workers gaining control of the government sitting down. And so a civil war was brewing. Lenin would quickly, and the Bolsheviks would quickly find out that they didn't even have full control of the country when they asked Tsarist General Dukhonin, the head of the military, to begin putting an end to Russia's World War I, because the General Dukhonin would simply just refuse. Lenin, in a show of force, would go to a radio station and tell all soldiers that General Dukhonin was no longer their commander, and that if they had any Tsarist generals left, to fight them, and to make peace with any Germans that they could. Lenin would also begin working for negotiations with a peace between Germany and Russia. However, Germany would begin invading Russia in the middle of those peace talks, and the Soviets would quickly begin scrambling together a response. They managed to barely repel the Germans, and this repelling of the German armies would be the birth of the Red Army. With the army back in Bolshevik control, Lenin would push to end the war with the negotiations of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which would end Russia's fight with Germany by late February. And following the close call with Germany, the Soviets would begin preparing for possible other invasions from other governments. In March, the Soviet government would be moved to Moscow from Petrograd, where the Russian Revolution had begun. Meanwhile, Lenin would begin drawing up plans for the Soviet state, such as rebuilding the destroyed Russia, electrifying Russia, including the countryside, and what they would do once they fully secured power. Ideally, to Lenin, socialist planning would involve the input of all Soviet civilians. And on June 28th, he would begin to do the early parts of this through nationalizing the heavy industries of Russia. The Soviet Union was now in a total state of war, and the revolution needed to be defended, however. As in 1918, 13 nations, including Great Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, would invade the USSR in alliance with the White Armies. The White Armies were the armies that wanted to bring back Tsarism, bring back capitalism, bring back reactionaryism. And they would all come together to stop the communist revolution. They would also invade at the same time that kulaks, rich peasants, would begin rebelling en masse to cut off food supplies, fuel, things like that. And so on January 28, 1918, Lenin and the Bolsheviks would sign decrees that would officially form the Red Army to defend the revolution against these growing threats. And by 1919, 3 million men would be bearing arms under the banner of the Red Army to defend socialism. As the Civil War raged on, food became scarce. Starvation ravaged Russia. Lenin's health itself took a major blow, as on August 30th, 1918, during a speech in Moscow, he would be shot 2 times in the chest by anarchists. Following that attempt on Lenin's life and that growing White Army 13-nation invasion and a number of sabotage plans, the Russian Bolsheviks would decide to do the Red Terrors in order to purge their society of all those who were collaborators, of capitalists, and all those who could help the 13 nations and the White Armies invading Russia. 2 weeks after getting shot, Lenin would be back in good health to help various committees and to preserve the revolution. However, in 1918, which was the first year anniversary of the Russian Revolution, the USSR and the Soviets were completely isolated from the world. They had no allies. Hunger was setting into Russia. And amidst the chaos of the Civil War with the Whites and the 13 foreign nations invading Russia, 3/4 of Russia was controlled by the White Armies and them. December 1918 would also see the Soviets' Eastern Front get pushed back, with them beginning to lose strategic points, forcing the Soviets to send in as many reinforcements as they could to their Eastern Front. However, finally, in 1918, they would get a spark of hope, as the Entente, which was the UK, Russia, France, and America, would begin suing for peace with Germany, as World War I would begin winding down. With the defeat of the Central Powers, communist parties would spring up all over Europe too, and pseudo-revolutions and worker strikes would break out. Revolutions, and attempted revolutions would break out in Germany, Austria, Hungary. Lenin would seize on this revolutionary fervor to found the Third International in Moscow in March 2nd, 1919, where the First Congress would meet. The Third International would take on the work that the Second International had abandoned, under the banner of scientific socialism, revolutionary defeatism, and attacking anti-imperialism, under that excellent analysis of Lenin through his work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and through Lenin bringing Marxism into the age of capitalism, or imperialism, After the defeat of Germany and the Entente in World War I, the USSR would begin getting circled by heavy blockades, with capitalist powers hoping to destroy it. And Admiral Kolchak of the White Army would be announced as the official ruler of Russia by the Western powers, by all the Entente powers. And capitalist reaction would begin to circle in on the Soviets. On April 11th, 1919, the Soviets would turn all their attention towards defeating Kolchak, who had been announced as the new ruler of Russia. And as Kolchak's army drew into the Urals, which is a region of Russia, the Soviets would throw the main thrust of their army against him there. Meanwhile, the Whites, under General Yudenich, would attempt to launch a major counteroffensive in Petrograd to take pressure off of Kolchak. This offensive would lead to a series of purges of possible collaborators with the White Army all across Russia, who might be feeding Kolchak and Yudenich army's information. With a combination of Soviet Navy, Red Army, and the workers of Petrograd, Yudenich's offensive would be defeated, as would the offensive of Kolchak by 1919. And by the summer of 1919, for the 14 nations, including Japan, the UK, America, that had invaded the Soviet Union and the White armies, would begin turning their energies into the south of Russia for an offensive under the General Denkin, with the thrust of Soviet forces being drawn there, railroads and food supplies, all being moved towards the south of Russia for the total defeat of General Denikin, General Denikin, I'm sorry. By 1920, the White armies and the invading nations had been defeated. Finally, after defeating Denikin, the Soviets had prevailed. They had won. Throughout the rest of the 1920s, the Bolsheviks would continue to build the industrial and economic base for socialism. Towards the end of the 1920s, one more campaign would be fought by the Soviets to repel the White armies in Poland, which they would manage to quickly repel. And during this year of 1920, Lenin would end up publishing his famous work, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, Lenin basically argues in that we should work within trade unions and congresses, parliaments to spread our message, not to be reformists and to pass like universal health care, but to use these systems to help organize workers and to get them radicalized, to set up party bases, spread our messages, things like that, in order to destroy the system, basically use the system itself as a tool to destroy itself, including pre-existing trade unions and congresses, and not to form your own congress or trade union until it's absolutely needed in the end. The entire international working class also played in the victory of the Russian Revolution over the White armies and the 13 nations that invaded Russia. Because if it had not been for working class people all over the world organizing strikes and refusing to load ships with weapons meant for the White armies and against the Bolsheviks, they would not have won. And so the whole international working class came together through strikes in a beautiful show of solidarity to help the Bolsheviks and the Red armies win against the Whites and the 13 nations that invaded them. With relative peace setting into the Soviets, Lenin and the Bolsheviks decided they needed to shift economic policies. Because under civil war, they had employed war communism. And war communism had basically meant strict grain collection measures against peasants in order to feed cities, state seizures of industries, with Russia being completely ravaged, and, heavy, strict control of the entire economy. But with Russia being completely destroyed by the White armies, by World War I, by these 13 nations invading, they would opt for new economic policy, or NEP, around 1921. And NEP would get rid of the strict grain collection. They would allow some privatization of light industries. Russia would still maintain control of the central bank and the major industries, but some light industry. And this would all be done to recover the economy, to lay down the basis for socialism through a controlled capitalism, essentially. And so NEP is interesting. It's been studied by a lot of people. Some people argue that Dengism in Russia and China, modern day China, is an attempt by China to learn from what Russia was doing with NEP and apply it to their country. The goals of NEP ultimately were to recover both the USSR's completely destroyed economy. After all, being in total state of war and civil war destroys a complete country. This was essentially, what happened in Russia was essentially the apocalypse, right? Russia went through the worst imaginable apocalypse possible in order to get their communist revolution done. And also to revitalize the alliance between peasants and workers, as peasants and workers' relations had really waned. especially during the strict grain acquisition policies of wartime communism in order to feed cities and the troops that the government had implemented. The main goals of NEP were also to consolidate the various different economic systems that the USSR was contradictorily operating at the time, because Lenin recognized that Russia at that time was operating 4 different economies at the same time, and that was private capitalism, state capitalism, which was that nationalization of heavy industries, socialism, and small commodity production of the peasants. And so the NEP's goal was to sort of create a more streamlined economy in which a lot of these contradictory economic policies were gotten rid of into one, especially one that would allow the peasants to transition from small commodity producers into a uniform class. Thusly, NEP's biggest goal was just to lay down the foundations for building a broader socialist society on top of it. So basically now communists were controlling liberalism, right? Whereas before, the Mensheviks had just wanted to hand over power to the bourgeois and the liberals. Communists were controlling capitalism to allow for that slow building up of that socialist base. Lenin during this time would even expound early ideas that Mao would expand on, like cultural revolution, in which he would try to raise a new communist culture to let people get rid of their previous cultural attachments to capitalism. Because even though you can change the economic base of a society, even though you can change the economy of a society, people will still culturally hold on to old bourgeois capitalist ideas. And he also worked to make literacy, education, and culture more accessible to the masses. In 1921, Lenin would head a purge of the Communist Party. Now, this purge would not be like the great purges much later in which people would be jailed and killed. It would just more so see people getting kicked out of the Communist Party for not being very well educated, disciplined, things like that. A lot of people had joined the Communist Party that weren't really communists, that didn't really understand Marxism. In March 22nd, the 11th Congress of the party would take place. And the 11th Congress of the Bolshevik Party would also be the last Congress that Lenin ever attended, as he would die 2 years later. A year into NEP, Lenin would summarize the successes that they had, proclaiming that the Soviets retained control of key industries while commercial markets had been allowed and recovered the Soviet economy. That alliance between the peasants and the proletarians was repaired, and the peasants were even beginning to produce more grain. However, with that previous assassination attempt on his life, Lenin's health began taking a nosedive. While living with Gorky, Lenin temporarily, due to his failing health, stopped appearing at work. And in 1922, in the month of May, he suffered his first major stroke, making him temporarily lose the ability to use his right arm and his leg. Lenin would also be advised by his doctors not to discuss politics after that stroke, and he would absolutely hate that. On November 20th, 1922, after recovering enough to get back to a little bit of work, Lenin would deliver his last speech ever, in which he would proclaim, quote, "We have dragged socialism into everyday life, and here we make able to keep our bearings. This is the task of our day. This is the task of our epoch. Permit me to conclude by expressing the conviction that, difficult as this may be, new as it may be compared to our previous task, and no matter how many difficulties it may cause us, we shall all, not in one day, but in the course of several years, all of us together fulfill, come what may, and NEP Russia will be transformed into a socialist Russia." After this speech, Lenin's health would worsen so much that he would be forced away from the public light. And on March 9th, 1923, Lenin would suffer another stroke. The 12th Soviet Congress, which was supposed to be headed by Lenin, would be forced to adjourn without him being there. It would be the first Congress that Lenin ever missed. And on October 19th, 1923, Lenin would visit Moscow for the final time, meeting people, visiting his quaint apartment, talking to the masses. and committees. As just a few months later, on January 21st, 1924, Lenin passed away. That night, the Central Committee would proclaim Lenin's death. And in that proclamation of Lenin's death on January 21st, 1924, they would say, quote, "Never since the birth of Marx has the great proletarian movement for the emancipation produced such a titanic figure as our late leader, teacher, and friend Lenin, who possessed all the truly great heroic virtues of the proletariat, a fearless mind, an iron, inflexible, indomitable will, which surmount all obstacles, a holy moral hatred of slavery and tyranny, revolutionary ardor which moved mountains, boundless faith in the creative power of the masses, and a vast organizing talent. His name became a symbol for a new world, west to east and from south to north." At 10 a.m. on January 23rd, Lenin's coffin would be carried for a state funeral, and workers all across the world would observe a 5-minute silence in their factories for Lenin's passing. And so that was the life of Lenin. And I think Lenin was just such a lightning in the bottle. Lenin took Marxism from a mechanical ideology into a living. He took Marxism from a previous stage into the imperialist stage. He took Marxism from an idea on paper into practice, actual tangibility. He expanded the Marxist scientific theory so much in so many ways, showed us how to do revolution, how to form it, how to overthrow capitalism, how to push the workers. Lenin was a human being, but he also, through his life, through his actions, through his scientific analysis, which holds so true today, became a titan, a symbol of a new world, which is better. A new, better world in which every man is equal, free from exploitation. A world without homelessness. A world without poverty. A world without exploitation or imperialism. A world in which even the lowliest African peasant has health care, has democratic control over his means of production, and is not at the hands of imperialists hundreds of miles away in Great Britain or in America. Lenin ultimately represented a woman, ultimately represented the colonized, ultimately represented all the damned of the earth, and he fought for them, and he gave them an ideology that could help them liberate themselves from India to China, from Cuba to South Africa. Lenin stands as a titan of history, a titan of a better world beyond this capitalism, beyond this imperialism, beyond this exploitation, beyond this unequal exchange in which 8 men have as much wealth as half the world. And even though in 1991 it seemed as though Lenin's ideas are dead, his ideas ring more true than ever, as neoliberalism and globalism get rid of all borders and exploit the proletarian of the world in a way which has never been seen before. Humanity has one choice, one simple choice: Leninism or extinction. And if it does not choose Lenin, it will go extinct. And if it chooses Lenin, it will not go extinct under an ego-fascist collapse that neoliberal capitalism seems so hell-bent on taking us towards. Study Lenin. Learn from him. Recognize that he was a man. But study the scientific analysis that he made, the movement that he made. And win, because we have no other choice. It's either win under Lenin's banner or go extinct. Thank you, comrades.
This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin. I barely...
And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you can also get episodes up to a month early. Thank you.